Good afternoon. Welcome back. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Timothy Nash. Is that yeah. Oh, I'm teasing him. We're good friends, but I have to give him a zing. I mean, what's the point of having a friend if you can't zing him, right? Okay, but it is really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Timothy Nash. Dr. Nash is the David Fry Chair Holder in Economics at Northwood University. He is an Associate Professor of Economics in both the Northwood undergraduate program and Associate Professor in the DeVos School of Management, Graduate School at Northwood University. He earned his undergraduate degree at Northwood University. He has his master's from Central Michigan University, and he has his PhD from Wayne State University. I could go on and on about what Dr. Nash does at Northwood University. He lectures widely for the university in its various programs in other parts of the world. He's lectured in China, in various parts of Europe. He is the co-editor of that mainstay textbook at Northwood University that all students have a chance to go through when they take Philosophy of American Enterprise, the co-author of When We Are Free. He is also, and I'm very happy to say, the co-author and co-editor, along with President Keith Priddy, of our volume In Defense of Capitalism. He is a specialist in automotive marketing and automotive aftermarketing. He writes widely on these themes and in public policy in general. He is a mainstay on many of the television and radio and newsprint media outlets in Michigan. He's a very popular and sought-after discussant and news evaluator by NBC, CBS, NBC, both in the affiliates in the Michigan area as well as nationally. He is an outstanding public speaker and unbelievably articulate defender of the Northwood idea, which is these ideas of individual freedom, limited government, and the free market, which is the theme of this seminar. And all I can say, in addition to that, he lives in Midland. He has a delightful and lovely wife, Pam. He has 4 children, and he has relatively newly arrived and still under shop warranty, a grandchild. How old is the grandchild now, Tim? Almost 8 months. He's still under the 12-month warranty. Can be returned, parts and labor taken care of. And he is going to be talking to you this afternoon about what I think are some vital subjects, which was sort of a tease theme of my last comments this morning. And that is these issues of how do we handle, as a nation and as a country, these entitlement programs, which not only restrain the freedom of each American citizen by being required to be part of these government-managed redistributive programs, but which are fiscally and financially threatening to stranglehold as a nation unless we find some market-based private alternatives as a solution to this paternalistic policy that is basically undermining the fundamental principles upon which this country was founded. So without further ado, my truly and sincerely good and valued friend, Dr. Tim Nash.
Appreciate it, sir. Thank you, Richard, and he got it almost the way I wrote it for him. It is an honor to be here with you, ladies and gentlemen, and it is an honor to follow Dr. Ebling and to take a look at a couple of topics that I hope complement and supplement Richard's remarks. What I would say to you in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is that as you look at where we are today, hopefully you're going to see a theme that is a series of guideposts for you when you look at the Freedom Seminar. I've had the honor of attending all 34 Northwood University Freedom Seminars, and I attended the first couple, like all of you are in the room, as a student. And when you look at the Freedom Seminar, our theme has always been freedom, sound money, and a strong America. And when you look at where we are today, we're simply making the point that as you look at the greatness of this country, you look at the greatness of Western civilization, it really truly is based on the ideas that Dr. Ebeling so eloquently and thoroughly outlined, that it's free people, free individuals can and do accomplish great things. But when they're not allowed to be free, when you curtail their freedom, you curtail the productivity for not just that individual, but literally for the masses. I had a wonderful mom, and my mom passed away last week, and she was just this beautiful human being. I used to say she had the heart of she had a heart of gold, and she was tough as barbed wire. And my mom instilled in me this, and in my other 8 siblings, there were 9 of us, she instilled in all of us this love of America and this love of freedom. And my mother got that from my grandfather. And I'm half Polish and half Irish, and my mom's a purebred Polak, as she would say, and my dad's a purebred Irishman. And my mom's dad came over to the United States from a place called Ostrowiecka, Poland, which is north of Warszawa, or in English, north of Warsaw. And he came over to the United States because the Russians, the Tsars, were occupying northern Poland. And their family's land had been expropriated by the Russians, and they wanted their 13-year-old son, Joseph Gwasik, to have a better life. And they had heard all these great things about the United States, and that, you know, the roads were paved in gold, that there were opportunities around every corner. And when my grandfather came to the United States, he didn't find that. He got off the boat at Ellis Island. He put his suit on just like his mother had instructed him. And he got off the boat, and he was walking down the gangplank, and the previous group of immigrants to the United States had been the Italians. And my grandfather is walking down this gangplank, and there are a whole bunch of Italian men lined up on this platform, and they're urinating on the Polish. It's a true story. And here he is. He goes into downtown New York, and he has this suit that he thought was a beautiful suit, and he smells like urine, as did a whole bunch of the other people. And the interesting part of it is that the United States that he found initially was not a welcoming place. And he looked, and he tried to get a job, and he's doing all the things that he was supposed to, and he couldn't find the relatives that his mom had written to. And then he migrated to Wisconsin and then came to Detroit. But what he realized very quickly was that he had opportunities that he didn't have back in Poland. And he quickly learned to speak English. He got a job in the auto industry and eventually became a foreman in a Chrysler factory. But he constantly stayed in communication and would write to his relatives back in Poland. And while they were under a totalitarian system, the one thing that he realized was that the odds weren't stacked against him the way that he thought they were. He would tell me in broken English that if he had had the chance to get back on the next boat and go back to Poland, he would have been there. He truly experienced the American dream. And so for me, my innate belief in freedom and free markets started with stories from my grandfather and then stories from my mom. And then the second thing for me that was always an interesting part of who I became was that I grew up not too far from here in northwest Detroit. I went to a school called St. Mary's of Redford, which the high school is now closed. Unfortunately, most of the Catholic high schools in Detroit closed a few years ago for financial reasons. But I remember walking to school, and I was in 6th grade. My older brother Chris, who's a VP of investments for Oppenheimer, he and I were walking to school, and we walked the same route, 1.1 miles from our home to the front doors of St. Mary's. And one day we're walking down the street, and this man who was obviously blind came out the door of a house 7 houses before Finkel on Asbury Park. And we'd walk around him and say hello and walk to school. Well, this happened every morning. He came out at the same time, and we'd walk around him. And then one day he says, boys, could you leave 10 minutes earlier and meet me here and walk with me to the bus stop? We said, sure. And turns out his name was Tom Harico. He was an investment advisor at Merrill Lynch. He got to know us, and he asked my older brother, Chris, if Chris would read the Wall Street Journal to him at the end of the day, because he was married, he had 2 young kids, and his wife was very busy, and obviously the Wall Street Journal wasn't out in Braille at the time, so my older brother Chris started reading the Wall Street Journal to him. And then when my brother went off to major in economics and finance at the University of Detroit, I started to read the Wall Street Journal to Mr. Harico. And the thing that was amazing about Mr. Harico is that he never complained about where he was in life. Never complained about the fact that he had been blind almost from birth. Never complained about the fact that he had to find his way down a street that he'd never seen, to a bus stop that he'd never seen in his life. He depended on the kindness of individuals to get onto that bus, to make the changes and get to downtown Detroit to his office at Merrill Lynch. And when Tom Harico died, he was a multimillionaire from his investments. And I thought about it. He never saw a stock certificate from any of those companies that he invested in. He would go visit a company, but he couldn't see it. He could touch it, he could smell it, he could sense it. But all he talked about was the wonderful opportunities because he lived in a free society. And then he talked about his relatives back in Eastern Europe who marveled at what Tom had and complained about what they didn't have and the opportunities. And so for me, this whole notion of freedom and the Freedom Seminar and why we're doing it for 34 years and the honor that I have to be associated with colleagues like Richard Ebling and Dale Matchek and certainly Dr. Priddy, our president, and to have a good friend like Michael Cox who kicked off the seminar. I think what's really important is that you make the most out of the seminar. But if you have questions, continue to question. You're asking a lot of good questions. But America's different today. It's different today than it was when I sat in a similar seat 34 years ago. And it's not as vibrant. It's not as dynamic as it used to be. And I'll try to make some of those points in my second talk tomorrow. But it's still the greatest economy in the history of the world. It's still the place that most people want to be. And it's up to all of you and a lot of other brilliant young people like yourselves to make that happen. These are challenging times, but we have overcome the challenging times on many instances in the history of this country. So understand that the ideas are important, but hopefully you're here for a lot more than just a grade. So with that as a background, that's what influences me and influences some of the things that make me who I am and call me to think as I do. But in the end, you can't make decisions or give talks or argue a particular point based on feelings or emotions. You have to do it based on sheer economic logic and facts. And so what I'd like to do with the first presentation here is to, first of all, give a tribute to Steve Kronk. Some of you may know Steve. I had the honor of working with Steve last year. He was one of our Koch scholars. And Charles Koch and the Koch Foundation, Mr. Koch and his father started Koch Industries. It's a privately traded company. But you may not have ever heard of Koch Industries, but they own companies like Georgia Pacific and Koch Oil and Gas. And last year they did $112 billion in sales. If it were a publicly traded company, it'd be in the top 10 companies on the Fortune 500. But it's not listed in the Fortune 500 because the stock is all privately held. It's not publicly traded. And Mr. Koch has been this wonderful supporter of Northwood and many other colleges and universities and of free enterprise. And Steve did a research paper that I helped him with, and I know he sought Dr. Ebling's feedback as well on Social Security, and it received a tremendous amount of positive feedback in a number of circles, including from the Koch Foundation. And so what's important is to give credit where credit's due, and in this case, a lot of the research was the good work of Steve. As you look at Social Security, first and foremost, the real question is, do we make decisions based on an individual's well-intended, good-hearted ideas, or do we truly make decisions based on what is going to work and what economically is feasible? And what I would say to you today is that Social Security has remnants that go back to the Civil War. If you go back to the Civil War in the United States, there was a Social Security system, a retirement system, a health care system that was given to veterans of the U.S. Civil War. And if you also look at Social Security, there are remnants that impact what we were taking a look at that would go back to the Germany of the mid to late 1800s. And the argument is that when you look at Social Security, that people, to Richard's point, people aren't smart enough, or people don't care enough, or people are too selfish, that they wouldn't put money away for themselves, and so therefore the government must do it. Now, first and foremost, I reject that notion, and I reject that Social Security is something that we would not do, or it's something that we would not plan for our retirement if not for the government. The second point that I would ask you to look at, and there's a wonderful book out entitled How to Buy Stocks. And the last chapter in the book, it's by a fellow named Ingalls, E-N-G-E-L-S. And the last chapter in the book, Mr. Ingalls is always updating everything but the last chapter. But he points out in the book that there's a fellow who was the janitor on the New York Stock Exchange and never made anything more than minimum wage all of his life, but found enough money in his minimum wage and befriended enough people on the exchange, the traders on the floor, that he died a millionaire. And he died a millionaire in $1946. So if you looked at it today, he'd be worth about $13 million in 2011 dollars. Or another thing to take a look at when we argue that that Social Security is something that that doesn't work for. There's a need for Social Security because poor people aren't smart enough, or poor people couldn't plan properly for their retirement. And if you did the math, and you ought to try this, you've all had accounting and finance courses, but take a look at what it would be in terms of an investment if you had made nothing but minimum wage all of your life. You started at age 18, you retire at age 65. How many years would you work? If you start at age 18 and you retire at age 65. Okay, you work for 47 years. And if you made nothing but minimum wage, and you had an average rate of return of 6%, which is quite a bit lower than the average rate of return on the New York Stock Exchange, You took the money that you would put in Social Security and that your employer would match, and you got 6%. So just the money that you would put into Social Security, your employer would match. What would you have in Social Security at the time you were 65? Anyone? Take a guess. You'd have enough money to have a medical IRA that would pay you as well, if not better, than Medicare today. And you would have just under $600,000 in an IRA account. And if you paid yourself 6% on $600,000, what would your yearly income be? How much? 600,000 times 6%. Ferris Bueller's Big Day Off. Anyone? Very good. $36,000. All right. Now, what do you think a person makes from the government on Social Security today if they paid in nothing but minimum wage all their life? What do you think they get paid? It's between $12,000 and $15,000 depending on whether they have a spouse and a couple of other factors that come into play. Now, second point is this. When that person dies, the person that's paid into the Social Security system, what do they leave their family? The person that's paid into Social Security? Nothing. If we had it as a private system, what would that person leave to their family? How much? $600,000, absolutely. And if you didn't like your kids, what would you do? Spend it, leave it to charity, donate it to Dr. Ebling's investment fund. But the point is, that's an example of a person making nothing more than minimum wage. Now, you could make the argument that there are some people that might not be able to work and might not be able to make a minimum wage all of their life. My youngest sister, who passed away a couple of years ago, was Down syndrome. And if not for my loving parents, Mary was not capable of functioning. And so if her siblings didn't take care of her, you could make the argument there might be a role for government in those cases. Now, I don't happen to accept that idea, but even if you made that argument, Social Security, if you look at it from the point of view that I just established, makes no sense at all. Because low-income people, people who make nothing more than minimum wage, are far better off under a market system than is the case today. So how do we create a system in 1935 that today is a system that all of us have to participate in, except for a few government employee exceptions, which I always find interesting? How can we have to participate in that system when the vast majority of people, well over 95% of people, are better off under a free market-based Social Security system? And ladies and gentlemen, that's the problem. Most people don't know the history. They don't know the facts regarding Social Security. It's a system that from the beginning, even Mr. Roosevelt, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, rejected it 6 times. And they say that he finally had a persistent aide that convinced him to sign it into law in 1935. And some people say he just wanted to get this person off his back. But when you look at it, it's important to understand that maybe there are 5%, give some people the benefit of the doubt and say 10% of the population is far better off under Social Security. why do you build a system where the masses of the people would be far better off under a private system, would be far better off paying an additional amount of taxes to take care of that 5 or 10%? Why do we penalize the entire population for something that really is needed by a very few? Now, it's not my topic today, but I will just simply say to you that I would, as Richard pointed out, I would be much more comfortable with that 5 or 10% being taken care of by the private sector as well. If you look at study after study after study, if you give $1 to help a poor person to the government, most studies show that about 20 cents on the dollar gets to the poor person. In other words, about 80 cents on every dollar is eaten up by administrative cost. And 20 cents on the dollar gets to help the poor or the needy. If you give it to the United Way, if you give it to your synagogue or your mosque or your church, if you give it to a whole plethora of organizations, from the Salvation Army to Big Brothers Big Sisters, they take care of the needy at a much more efficient rate. Anywhere from 70% to 100% of those dollars get to the poor person or the person in need. Now again, my youngest sister was Down syndrome when she passed away. It'll be 3 years ago this summer. My parents were just very touched by the fact that from the time Mary was 26 to the time she died at almost age 44, she went to every day, 5 days a week, she went half a day and worked for a person that paid her sub-minimum wage and could afford to employ my sister at sub-minimum wage and be profitable. And the government allowed her to be employed at sub-minimum wage. It was very big of them. But she worked for $4 an hour. She made money. She had the pride of work. She had a job. She had a paycheck. You know, she'd take you out to dinner sometimes. And you could see, even for somebody who had the IQ of a 5 or a 6-year-old and the body of an adult, she appreciated and understood the value of work. But the other half of the day, she went to this place called the Just Us Club. And it was for people with special needs. And it was put on, we're Catholics, but it was put together by a Baptist church in Ann Arbor. And when my sister passed away, my parents said, in lieu of flowers, would you please make a contribution to the Just Us Club? And they were very pleased and honored that they got over $7,000 as a result of the family's request to have people support it. And every year they get another $3,000 or $4,000 from those same people that continue to support it because they got to know of the Just Us Club because of my sister Mary's death. And when my mom passed away, we did the same thing. And the first round, just the envelopes collected at the funeral home, was over. My dad dropped off on Tuesday almost $4,000 to the Just Us Club. And I'm sure there'll be more of that in the future. And when we were talking about my parents' estate, my dad intends to leave $100,000 to the Just Us Club. Now, I give you that as just a personal example of what free people do, but the fact of the matter is that my sister was too old to be able to go to the public schools. At 26, the special needs programs end. Now, in some cases, you say, well, 26, that's pretty good that they let her go to age 26. But my point is, the market steps in and comes up with solutions to these kinds of problems. And so even those individuals that we think the government's going to take care of them, that they're better off, just remember or think about the whole notion of administrative cost. And don't take anything that you hear today as gospel. Look into it, check it out, research it. But the point is that there are free people that will end up volunteering and doing things that take care of those in need much more effectively, much more efficiently than oftentimes the government does. And I could tell you stories of growing up in Detroit. I could tell you stories of a parent or an aunt or an uncle that got involved in volunteerism and helped a neighbor that had lost a job. And I can't tell you how many times at church or with an organization that my dad or an uncle or a friend was associated with, they would take clothing over to a home where somebody had lost a job or take food over there. But the thing that was real important, and it's not that government workers aren't good people or they're not caring people, because they are. But they don't get to know that person as effectively or as efficiently. As Richard was pointing out, they don't know who you are. They don't know you on the micro level. But I can tell you example after example of somebody who got to know somebody through a charity, found out the person was unemployed, got to know them, found out who they were and how talented they were, and found them a job. Got him a job working as a meter reader for the gas company or as in the fireman's apprentice program with the Detroit Fire Department, or got him a job on an assembly line, or helped them do whatever the case may be. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the hallmark of this country. Another book that I would recommend beyond the ones that Dr. Ebeling mentioned was Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat who came to the United States, and he wrote this book about the United States in the late 1820s, early 1830s, because what he found in the United States was this country of people who never said it can't be done, who had this can-do spirit, but he also talked about the voluntarism in the United States, the fact that Americans cared about each other, that Americans were charitable, and that Americans took care of each other. And that's why, to Richard's point, you look at these studies. Americans give more time in terms of voluntarism by a factor of 3 than the next industrialized country in the world, because it's part of our DNA. Americans give to charity at a much higher rate than any other country in the world. But the trade-off with that is that we expected less government. We expected lower taxes. We expected lower regulations. We expected that if we didn't want bigger government, we had to step up to the plate and take care of our brethren, not because we had to or that legally we're obligated to do it, but because we wanted to do it. And I'll show you between the 2 talks today and tomorrow that those things, unfortunately, are changing as well. And it's one of the reasons why we have the Excel program at Northwood. We want you to understand that voluntarism is part of what's made the American dream. And voluntarism is important because if you want less government, if you want a more efficient economy, you've got to volunteer, you've got to step up and write a check to help somebody that's less fortunate. Because hopefully you will never get into that position, but if you do, you're going to depend on those individuals to step up and to help you. So if you look at the issue getting back to Social Security, that's how I would frame it. I would frame it that when you look at Social Security today, there's great debate on whether or not we actually needed it or wanted it. But we ended up getting it. And so then let's talk a little bit about the progression from the time that we got it. And if you look here, Social Security became law in 1935. We began accepting or collecting taxes, gang, in 1937. Okay? Very important date. So from 1937 to 1940, we generated trust funds. And we accumulated these dollars, and these dollars were meant to be put into big investment funds. You know, they used the term lockbox back then so that nobody would touch those dollars. And then in 1940, we began making Social Security payments. Problem is this. There is the first Social Security recipient, a lady by the name of Ida Mae Fuller. And Mrs. Fuller put in a total of $30 into Social Security. Her employer matched it for a grand total of $60. And Mrs. Fuller, I believe, died in 1965. Started collecting in 1940, and it was either 1963 or 1965 she passed away. Mrs. Fuller received almost $26,000 in payments. And so first and foremost, from an actuarial basis, the early recipients got paid much, much more from the system than they paid in. And so it set the system off on a bad foot, because structurally you had a situation where the many recipients that paid in paid very little, if anything, into the system and received large amounts of money. Okay? Another thing for you to take a look at. Today, as you analyze where we're at with Social Security, it's the second largest budget item in the federal budget. And as you come down here, you have 3 people that are paying into the system today for every 1 person receiving Social Security. And what that means is that we are in a very difficult position. What it means is that in the not too distant future, by 2020, it'll be about 2.5 people paying into the system for every 1 person receiving. And by 2040, if the system makes it that far, based on birth rates and our tighter immigration policy, it'll be 1 person paying into the system for 1 person receiving, which means you will support another family on Social Security. And here's the factor. If you come back here and you look at Dale, I'm obviously doing something wrong here. Yeah. Can you take me back? About 2 slides back. I'll try it. Yeah, perfect. If you look at this, we're talking the year that Social Security was founded. We had 22 people paying into the system, not the year it was founded, but in 1937, we had 22 people paying into the system for every 1 person receiving Social Security. And as you take a look at a number of the factors, you can understand that, you know, as you look here at Mr. Black's quote, you're talking about the fact that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, meaning there's no doubt that the people that wanted Social Security to come about thought it was a good idea, didn't believe that a free society would do these things or could do them more efficiently. But what I think is important that you take a look at is that, am I pushing the wrong? Okay. Can you go back one just for grins? Okay, so as you take a look at this, the real issue is, what are the factors if you decide to write something on Social Security? The factors associated with the solvency of the system, beyond whether you think it's a good idea, whether it's a moral idea, whether it's something the government needed to do, I think I've made at least my position clear on that. The issue that I think you folks have to look at is, number one, you paid out the original recipients many, many times more than they deserved under an actuarial sound investment. You never would have, if it was a private sector system, you never would have paid people like Ida Mae Fuller $26,000 on a $60 investment. You would have had to have done a better job of looking at birth rates. You see that when you look at Social Security and you look at some of the changes in the United States, there's been a dramatic decline in birth rates. So you'll see that data in just a minute. But another factor that you have to take a look at is, again, our immigration policy. We have made it very difficult, as Dr. Cox was talking about last night, for people to migrate to the United States. And for people to migrate that are highly qualified, that are very inventive and innovative, that come up with new ideas, that start new businesses. And so the United States population grows via the birth rate, and there are a lot less good Catholics where we're having large households. My mom used to give me a hard time because, again, I told you I come from a family of 9. We have 4 kids. Most of my friends today say, God, how do you do it with 4? And people used to tell my mom that she was on birth control because she only had 9 kids in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And these are interesting points, but they're factors if you're trying to build an actuarially sound financial system. So our birth rates are down, and another factor, again, is immigration. We're not allowing people to migrate to the United States the way we used to. You know, that whole notion of the Statue of Liberty and give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. We're a rather insular country versus what we used to be. Now, you can debate whether that's a good thing or not, but the problem is it impacts this government program. The model was based on the fact of a much more rapidly growing population, a much more rapidly growing workforce of people that were going to support future recipients with regard to Social Security. We don't have the projections of GDP growth. We don't have the projections of people working and paying into the system for the people that are receiving the dollars. And see, this is all problematic when the government is running the system. Because under a private system, you're going to, each of you, you're going to have your own individual needs, your own individual risk tolerances, as Dr. Ebling mentioned during Q&A this morning, and you're going to have an individualized plan that will get you the rate of return that you need on investments, and it might mean investments in the U.S. You might put your investments in a foreign country to get that rate of return. All of those options don't exist when the government has a monopoly on this retirement system called Social Security. So take it then, and gang, look at the, and I apologize here, there's a typo, there's an H missing. But initially, Social Security was OA, okay? And the capital O and the capital A stood for old age. And that's what Social Security was designed to be. It was old age insurance. It was money that was put aside to complement and supplement your retirement dollars upon retirement. Well then, when these trust funds were building up large surpluses, politicians are looking at passing out goodies to get reelected, and they also are looking at having a big heart, and they wanted to be kind to people. And so they added the S. Does anybody know what the S stands for? Sorry? Go ahead, don't be shy. Okay, it stands for survivors. All right? Now, the problem is this. There was no new tax increase. There was no more new revenue coming in. But politicians said, why don't we give money to the survivors? So it became obvious that the spouse would get money upon retirement or death of the Social Security payee, but so would the children. And again, great idea, big heart. The problem was there's no additional money in the system to pay for this benefit. Then they said, you know, these trust funds have a lot of money. But again, most politicians don't have degrees in business like you folks do or will. They haven't studied economics. They haven't studied finance. They don't understand investments and cash flow. So they see these huge surpluses that you need. We need to have trillions of dollars in these trust funds in order for them to be sound over the long term and ensure that people are paid. And, there's not a politician that doesn't see a surplus that doesn't want to spend it for their own political gain. And that's a bit cynical, but in the end it's true. They don't think about the long term, and they don't think about what's best. They think about what's politically expedient. And so we added D, which stands for, disability. Very good. Again, noble cause. But we're saying people that were disabled ought to have certain benefits. Johnny, I did it again. If you can just go back for one more minute. As you take a look at it, we said we're going to give benefits to people that are disabled, and we're going to give those benefits to people that are disabled, but we weren't increasing the tax. We didn't have that money in there. So, think about where we are so far. We got a declining birth rate, declining immigration rate, declining number of people paying into the system versus the projections. We're paying out much higher rates of return than the investment warrants. We're adding people to the benefits. We're putting in the survivors, the disability insurance. And again, the dollars just aren't there. So then we add an H with the I. And that was then hospitalization or health insurance. And this is when we added the Medicare, Medicaid tax. But the first couple of years, we were paying it out and didn't have the money in there. And so these are factors that put the system in a very difficult position. Well then, take a look at it and you ask yourself the question, look at what's happened with birth rates. You can see the projected birth rates per 1,000 people, and look at the birth rates today. The birth rate is almost half today what it was in 1957. And again, nobody's making a judgment on whether or not we should have more babies or whether there ought to be mandates for more kids. In Canada, they actually give a baby bonus. They actually give you a tax break or a direct cash payment to have more kids because the Canadian population has actually hit negative birth rates. But the fact of the matter is, we do not have the birth rate that we expected that we would have. And then if you look at life expectancy, I'll show you tomorrow that in 1900, life expectancy for, well, I'll ask you this. Go back to England, 1750. Probably London was the most advanced economy in the world, the highest standard of living city in the world. What do you think average life expectancy was in 1750 in London? And who lived longer, males or females? Females live longer? Okay, how many agree with that? How many think females live longer in 1750? Okay, how many think males live longer? Okay, how many don't know? How many don't care because you weren't around in 1750? Males live longer than females. What was the leading cause of death for females? Childbirth. Average female lived less than 25 years in 1700. 75% of all children died before the age of 5. The average male lived to be about 28 in 1750. Go to 1900 in the United States. What was average life expectancy? Did males live longer or females live longer? 1900. Females live longer, you're right. What was the average life expectancy for a female? Little over 48. What was it for a male? Little over 46. And then you take a look at it today. Life expectancy is roughly 81 for a female in the United States. It's roughly 79 today in 2011. This data is about a little over a year old, 2 years old. The point with it is, these are factors that we didn't take into consideration. That people were going to be living what? Longer. And did we have enough money put away in the system for these individuals to live and to live longer, and were the funds going to be able to take care of these individuals? So as you go through and you start to look at what we need to do and how do we need to look at Social Security differently, more effectively, more efficiently, what's important for you to then understand is that if you look at different cases and you say to yourself, all right, I'm concerned about Social Security, and these points just reiterate the kinds of concerns over solvency that we've talked about. As you go through these, I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I've made these points, but this is just a good review for you. And so as you take a look at Social Security in general, the thing that's the biggest problem with Social Security in my mind is that it's not something that the government needs to do or should do or does very well. The other problem that you have, gang, with Social Security is that there's incredible amounts of intergovernment borrowing, meaning not only are all the factors that we've talked about so far problems that put the Social Security system at risk, but then you have the government borrowing money from the Social Security Trust Fund to fund roads. And why does the government borrow it? Because they get great terms. They borrow it over a long period of time, in most cases at what rate of interest? 0. So again, good for the government, good for the agency borrowing the money, bad for a true rate of return. Would you voluntarily put your money into Social Security as a pension fund option? How many of you would do that? How many of you go to work and you have an option for your 401k, your supplemental retirement account, and you have Oppenheimer as a choice, the Fidelity Fund, the Vanguard Fund, and then there was a fourth choice that said you can add more to your Social Security fund? How many people do you think would put money in that? Probably no one. Because as soon as you found out that you're loaning money from the Social Security fund to build roads or to put in place a government building, and that you're getting a 0 rate of return and you may not get paid back for 3 years, you're simply questioning this. Your eyes are rolling back in your head, and no one would want to be part of that. Now, a number of you have been kind enough to share what you want to do with your careers. You've talked about your family businesses. And I know at least 2 or 3 of you in here have automobile dealerships. And I know one of you has a Chevrolet dealership. What do you think your customers at the Chevy dealership would think if all you had was a Chevy dealership and you were saying to yourself, indirectly, Chevy products are terrible because you're driving a Toyota? What do you think your customers would think of your product then if you said, well, I know I sell Chevys, but damn, I wouldn't drive one? Or you're all probably too young, but when Lee Iacocca was trying to turn around Chrysler, he would do these commercials where he had a big cigar in his mouth and he would walk through a Chrysler plant and he would talk about the products, and then he'd say, if you can find a better car, what? Buy it. And what do you think would happen if Lee Iacocca walked out of there and got into a Ford and drove home? Do you think most people would have bought Chrysler products? The answer is no. But do you realize that a large number of government employees, the ones that are responsible for Social Security, the ones that brought Social Security to us, do you know for a long time you were a federal employee working for the Social Security Administration, and you had a choice to opt out of Social Security into a higher paying fund that was managed at the private sector level? Most people don't realize that. You realize that it was only recently, and it's not for most of the existing members of Congress. It's only for the new members from 6 years ago to date that they were mandated to have to participate in Social Security. Do they know something we don't know? And why do they get that option and we don't? Or another way of looking at it is, if you had Social Security and you issued it as a private company, let's say all of us got together and we said, we're hiring Dr. Ebling, he's going to be our CEO, and we're going to start our own retirement investment fund, and we're going to model it right after Social Security. Same actuarial standards, same enrollment process. Do you realize it would be illegal in all 50 states by the state's state insurance and retirement pension laws? And yet we have it at the federal level. And so my point with you is that as you look at Social Security, the real problem with it is that it is not sound. Structurally, it's not sound. It is not based on a logic or a need that makes sense. It's very inflexible, and it doesn't allow for different needs and different risk factors. So when you look at Social Security and you say to yourself, how do I meet the needs or the demands that I have? And what you find is that it is a system that doesn't allow you to do that. And so when you go through and you look at the system as a whole, you begin to go through and you begin to look at the fact that, all right, the Chilean system that I just went by in terms of the slides. As you look at the Chilean system, what's important is that Chile has at least taken a step in the right direction. Now, I'm not going to endorse the Chilean system in totality, but under the Chilean system, quite a few years ago, you had the option to either stay in the government system or you could opt out, still pay a tax rate to make certain that those on Social Security were being taken care of. But you had a choice of investing in a system that was market-based in the sense that you could put your money into a fund that invested in the Chilean stock market. And what's interesting is that in the Chilean system, number one, their system was on the verge of bankruptcy. They were looking at the same problems that we're looking at today. Right now, a recent report by the federal government says that there are unfunded liabilities, if the system continues the way it is, of somewhere between $65 and $70 trillion if we don't do something different by 2070. And there are reports that range from the fact that we would have to close to double the Social Security income tax on every individual in order to make the system solvent. To Richard was just sharing with me an article over lunch that other economists actually say you would have to increase your total tax burden on average by 60% to make the Social Security system whole. And so the argument that we should begin to phase the system out, I think, is the best solution. We've got to look at Social Security because right now, gang, I hate to say this to you, but none of you ought to count on getting Social Security. If we don't do something different, Social Security is not going to be here. And we've tried all the different fixes that we can. I'm 53 years old. When I started paying into Social Security, when I started working at age 16, I was told I could retire with full benefits at age 63. Then they realized how bad the system was, and about 20 years ago, they changed my retirement age to collect full benefits from Social Security to 65. Now, I've never missed a payment. I've paid in the maximum amount for the vast majority of my life, and they've said that I can't retire. 20 years ago they said, I can't retire with full benefits until 65. 10 years ago, I got another letter, and it said, I can't retire with full benefits until I'm 67. And oh, by the way, in the interim, from the time I started paying into the system, to date, they've raised my taxes on Social Security 15 times to make up for the shortfalls. And all I ask you to do is just think about the fact that if a private investment company that was planning your investment did the same thing, if they said, oh, we're sorry, we told you could retire at 65, now it's, or 63, now it's 65, you'd take them to court, you'd sue them, and you'd win. And if they kept charging you more for the same benefits, you'd take them to court and you'd sue them. Or at least if it was a free market, what would you do? You're right, you'd take your funds and you'd go someplace else. You'd switch, you'd find another investment person. You know, and as Richard pointed out with his insurance on his automobile, he's a valued customer. Anna's a valued customer. They don't want him to switch. But the pressure that they realize as an automobile insurance company, if they don't do a good job, the Eblings are going to go to a different company, seek a different alternative. That's the problem that you don't have today with Social Security. And what's interesting is that there are some unique examples. My problem with the Chilean system, I think in many ways it's a good idea, but my problem with it is, why do we stop there? The problem that you have today in Chile is the government has control, because all of those IRAs that are investing in private stocks are still controlled by whom? The government, exactly. The Chilean government still controls those funds. And so the problem with Social Security under a Chilean system is that right now the economy's done well. There's not a lot of money being misallocated to roads or to government buildings. There's money not being borrowed at a 0% rate of return. So that's far better than what we have right now. But the real worrisome part for me and for others is that you get the wrong government in there. Effectively, the government could change the whole board of directors, because the government, in many of these cases, has 30, 40, 50% ownership in some of the biggest and most productive companies in all of Chile. But Chile has been a marvelous example of cutting back government, reducing the size and scope of government. You know, to me, I hope the Chileans just take it one step further and say these mutual funds are no longer controlled by the government. These mutual funds you can invest in them freely. But their system is on a much sounder actuarial basis, a much sounder financial basis, because they said to people, you have this choice. And the thing that you ought to note is over 95% of Chileans said, I'm opting out of the government system and I'll go into these private IRAs. And so slowly but surely, over the next 20 years, the Chileans will be able to abolish their system. I think the Chileans need to take it to the next level and make certain that these IRAs are not controlled by the government. My view, I think Dr. Ebling shares the same view, is that if we're going to deal with Social Security, the German model hasn't worked because the Germans, again, are doing similar things to the Chileans, but they're doing some things that are misallocations of funds. As you go through and you look at a number of other options, what did I do? Oh, okay. The thing that I think is important in this case is that when you look at options and you think about the Social Security system, what I think is most important is that as you look at these things, it's a situation where when you're looking at the factors, here's the United States and here's the German economy. The solution is not what we're looking at today. If you're looking at the Germans are talking about extending the age that you can collect. Right now, whether you folks know it or not, if you're 22, 23 years of age, they're talking about you can't collect Social Security until you're at least 69. And they're talking about your taxes going up and your return dropping. And so as you go to and you look to the future, the real difficulty is what is the best possible solution? And what I would say to you is that as you go through and you look at these solutions, these are similar points or similar solutions to the issue. And what I would suggest to you is that probably the best analysis that I've seen in Social Security is by an economist named George Reisman. And Dr. Reisman has argued that what we really need to do is we need to be honest with the American public. And that is that Social Security is bankrupt. Social Security is insolvent, and Social Security needs to be phased out and turned over to the market. Meaning, we need to look at the obligations of people that have paid in. And individuals that are 55 years of age or younger are going to be given a similar option that the Chileans have given their people, and that is that you're going to be able to opt out of Social Security and put money into a super IRA, a private choice of your choice, not managed by the government. You'll still pay taxes, and those taxes will decline year after year as the people that are on Social Security die. And so as the last Social Security recipients, maybe 30 years from now, have all passed away, then slowly but surely you will dissolve over time the Social Security system. And then you as individuals will be allowed to put money into a retirement fund. It may have the same characteristics as an IRA, so you may be able to put it in with a tax advantage to yourself. You'll put those dollars into that system, and then you will earn the rate of return that exists based on the risk level that you choose and the investment cycle that you wish to be part of. And so my point with you is simply and unequivocally that as you look back and you reflect on this overview of Social Security, it's a system that was designed with noble intentions. It's a system that was put in place with kind-hearted ideas and in some cases with a view of political well-being. It's a system today that we refuse, ladies and gentlemen, to admit is broken. It was founded on unsound economic principles, and it is not going to work. It can't work because of the unsound foundation. We must look at it openly and honestly and say, we cannot afford this burden. It is becoming more and more a part of the burden of the United States, of our deficit, and whether you realize it or not, what brought Adolf Hitler to power was a collapse of the Weimar Republic. Germany, ladies and gentlemen, was one of the most powerful economies in the world. And at the end of World War II, World War I, they were saddled with the debt of the First World War, the reparations that they had to pay other countries, and they had Social Security in place since the late 1800s. It was unsound, it was underfunded, and it was that burden collectively with the war, the burden of the social welfare programs that caused the collapse of the German economy. Their taxes were high, their national debt was over 100% of GDP. Sound familiar? And so instead of cutting back the size and scope of government, the Germans printed money and caused a hyperinflation that led to the collapse of one of the great economies in the world at the time in terms of GDP and productivity. Not a model for free market or moral economics in terms of the way the country and the economy was organized, but it was a great industrial power that collapsed under the burden of this excessive debt. And so what I would say to you today, I don't think we're there, but if you had asked me when I was your age, would the debt of the United States be more than 35% of GDP? I'd have said no way. And we're in the next year, the national debt as a percent of GDP is going over 100% of GDP. And it's not the kind of debt that we can sustain. So I would say to you that when you look at the facts that we've talked about, the only logical conclusion is to stop the bleeding, to say we can't afford to do this. We're not throwing grandma and grandpa out on the street. We're not going to cut them off. We're going to do the moral and ethical and right thing, but we have to phase this system out. And I would encourage any of you, if you want to write your research paper on Social Security or include this as part of your research paper, let me know and I'll make certain you get a copy of Steve Kronk's paper. It's about 30 pages long, some great research in there. But if not, if there are other topics you're interested in, I would encourage you to look at the Northwood University website because there's a whole series of white papers that a number of us have written. Some of your fellow students have participated in writing those papers. Dr. Ebling has some up there, Dr. Matchek, etc. And those will all be great resources for you as you're looking to write the main research paper for your thesis or your project associated with the class obligation that you have. And with that in mind, I thank you and I'll answer any questions that you have. Thoughts? Questions? Too much information?
Can I just ask you?
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that Social Security will ever have a chance to bounce back with a different system? Or there's no system that can be
I just don't, you know, I'm a fairly good finance econ guy, and I just don't know. The question was, do I think Social Security can bounce back? Do I think that the system can be resurrected? I would say the answer is no because it's on unsound footing. When you look at the example I've tried to give you, and I know I gave you a lot of information, but you know, just go back and do the math on somebody that earned nothing but minimum wage and put it in a private account getting 6% a year. You know, if you look at the average over the last 50 years, the stock market has paid over 10% a year on average. Some years better, some years worse, but it's an average of 10%. So, and I gave you an example of just 6%, and you'd be far better off. So I would say I don't think that we can reverse it, and I think more important, I'd ask the question, why would we want to? I would say, especially for you folks, I would give up everything that I have coming to me in Social Security if the government would allow Social Security to be privatized. I'd say Pam and Tim Nash don't need any money just so you folks would have a chance to put money away and not have to worry about being 2-to-1 and 1-to-1. Because quite frankly, we've screwed it up for you. You folks shouldn't have to be worried about taking care of your families, growing your families. You know, you wonder why people want to have 1 or 2 kids instead of 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. You know, these are real burdens that you're going to have to look at. And by the time you guys are my age, you're going to be looking at Social Security, if it still exists, being 1-to-1. And it's just not right. Other questions? Yes?
With the baby boomers starting to collect Social Security, you're supposed to be starting to collect Social Security now.
Some are, you're right, some are.
How far after that do you give Social Security once they're all paid
Well, you know, the sad part of it is, I'll show you some charts tomorrow. Tomorrow my talk's on the national debt, the size and scope of government, et cetera. And I'll show you the fact that, you know, right now it's taking up a larger and larger burden of GDP. But the problem with it is, you know, we just keep raising taxes, we keep deferring the age. And the difficulty with it is that I think that if we continue along that road, we're looking 10 or 15 years. If we don't do anything radical, we're going to have a collapse. Because this country cannot stand the burden that it's under. You know, Michael Cox pointed out, we now have the highest tax rate in the industrialized world on business. And the problem is we're now beginning to increase the taxes on individuals. We've gone from being a medium to low tax country with low regulations to being a high tax, high regulation country. That's not us. That's not our DNA. That's not what made us the greatest economy in the history of the world. But if we don't do something about it, gang, we're going to have a financial collapse. It is inevitable, and I've never felt this way before. I am, if you know me well enough, if you know my friends were here, I'm accused of being, you know, too optimistic and the glass is 3/4 full. So I've never been a pessimist. I've always been an optimist, and this is still the greatest country in the world. And it has more positive characteristics than any country in the world today, even under our current situation. But it's up to all of us. It's a time for truth. We have to tell the truth. You know, I wish that Senator Levin was here. I've met Senator Levin on a couple of occasions. I've talked with him. But I'd love to debate Senator Levin on Social Security. Nobody wants to debate it because I'm giving you, honest to God, a pretty middle-of-the-road position. If I told you exactly how I felt about it, you know, you'd be all like, oh, we're doomed. You know, I'm going to go up. I wouldn't let you up. We wouldn't have lunch on the 8th floor because I'd be worried about a couple of you thinking about getting too close to the windows. It is challenging. We have some difficult times. But I truly believe that with the Tea Party movement and with a lot of other things, we can and will turn this thing around. So over the long term, I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic because I think we're going to get some form of privatization. I really believe that. And I think, you know, my other favorite quote is the quote by Winston Churchill. And after World War II, he said, "The price that people pay to be free is eternal vigilance." And a lot of people thought he was talking about the threat of the Nazis, the Allied forces with Churchill and the Brits and Roosevelt and the Americans and Stalin and the Soviets. The Allied forces had beaten the Germans back, and people thought he was talking about the expansion of Nazism or maybe the expansion of the Soviet Union. He was talking about the Fabian socialist movement that was winning elections in Great Britain. He was talking about economic freedom. He was not talking about political freedom, although he clearly had a position on political freedom. And that's what we've got to take a look at. Question in the back.
How long do you see Social Security being around? When do you expect to collapse?
Oh, I think Social Security will be around for a long time. I think Dr. Reisman's point about phasing it out is correct. I think that what we need to do is to, so we're talking about it being phased out over a 30 or 40-year period. And quite frankly, there are more people that are living beyond the age of 100 today. You folks were in school. I wish you all could have been there, but the opening of the game, the Loons game at Loons Stadium, the first pitch. Did any of you see that article in the Midland Daily News? This little old lady who lives at the Kingswood Senior Center, she threw out the first pitch, and she comes out to the mound on her walker. And she's standing on the mound, she's got her walker, and her 87-year-old son helped her out to the mound. She's 110 years old, and she made it halfway to home plate. So she threw the ball, what's it roughly, baseball players, what is it, 60 feet from the mound? 60 feet from the mound to home plate. She got it a little over halfway there. But, with people living longer, that extends the burden of Social Security. Okay, one more question. Anybody? Yes, sir. Well, that's a great question. And Richard and I are privileged enough to know some important members of Congress, and I'm not going to speak for any of them publicly, but they understand what we're up against. Their point is it's education. It's getting people to really sit down and see these problems. And it's not easy because there are a lot of people that say, hey, I paid in, I want my dues. But there are a lot of people that are paid in that are getting a lot more than they've actually paid in. But they don't understand it. And so I think that there are a lot of people in Washington that have a will to change it. They have a will to make a difference. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I'll segue, and then I've got to end this because Richard and I are doing we're going to take a break from about 3 to 3:20, okay? We're doing an interview with with NBC out of Flint. Here's a point that I'd make with you. And that is that when you look at these variables and you look at the financial crisis, I'd say about 10% of the financial crisis was due to immoral and unethical banking. The vast majority of it was caused by things like the Community Reinvestment Act, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are government entities that were allowed to become freely floating IPO stocks, but all the risk was still covered by the government. Very poor Federal Reserve monetary policy. But what most people don't realize is this. You know those 9 banks, the 9 big banks that the government bailed out? Most people don't realize this, but 7 out of the 9 banks didn't want the money, said they're not taking it, and the government said, you've got to take it. And President Obama doesn't stand up and tell you this, which I'm sure Barack Obama is a good and decent man. I just happen to disagree with him, but then I had a real problem with our second George Bush. So, right now I say a pox on both the political houses, but they don't tell the truth. They don't get up there and say, 7 of these banks didn't want it, and every one of them has paid back the TARP money plus a very reasonable rate of return in less than the duration that they were supposed to. But you don't hear that. And so the problem is right now, today, if I said to a lot of people, we're going to privatize Social Security and we're going to turn it over to Wall Street, a lot of people say, oh, those Wall Street people, they're evil. Those bankers have never paid us back. When in reality, Bank of America paid their money back and the government made 19% in 1 year on the money from Bank of America. Plus they made another $4 billion on stock warrants from Bank of America. And Bank of America didn't even want the money. And Bank of America wasn't the soundest of the 7 banks that didn't want the money. But for most of you, you're hearing that for the first time from me. Instead of standing up and saying, you know what, most of that TARP money's been paid back, even though Citibank is behind in its payments, the government's made enough money from the first 7 to almost cover it if Citibank never makes a full repayment of the TARP money. And then the other question is, okay, where's that 800 and some billion in TARP money? Why don't we turn around and use it to reduce the national debt? So my point with you, gang, is this. You're a bright and wonderful group. It's an honor for Richard and I and Keith and the rest of the faculty and staff to have you as students. But the key is life gets more interesting. It gets a lot more fun. But you need to be informed on these issues. You need to be challenged by these issues. And what you really need to do is go out there and make a difference. Because if you make a difference, and politicians, the good ones, feel that you're in their corner and you're going to back them, they will be the solution to the problem rather than the problem. All right, we'll see you all at 3:20. Thank you very much.